The next principle we'll be looking at is proximity. Proximity is something we understand intuitively. It requires no explanation when we see it. If you observe a group of people in a room, you can often learn a lot about who is listening intently to another person. You can see which people are strangers, and you can notice who is ignoring who by how close together they sit or stand. The distance between people indicates closeness or familiarity. You can also think about high school. There were groups of jocks, groups of freaks, there were loners, maybe there were gangs when you went to school. We perceive these persons, we comprehend these individual elements, if you will, based on their relationships and context. They are either separate and individual, or they are perceived as part of a group, and it's just like that in our compositions. In design, proximity or closeness creates a bond between the elements on a page. How close together or far apart elements are placed suggests a relationship, or lack of, between otherwise disparate parts. This also aids in achieving unity. If we have more or less an even distribution of shapes or elements, they all tend to stand alone. They are not in proximity to anything in particular, but when we bring these elements together as a cluster or collective or group, we view them as a new thing. We view them as something bigger. This helps us comprehend our environment. Complicated clusters of elements get simplified in our minds as one thing. They are that group or cluster, and this frees our minds from having to deal with them as individual units to be inventoried in our brain individually. You can mentally batch process the whole lot of them. This is important to understand in our designs. If we don't use proximity to our advantage, then our audience has to mentally sort through all that we have put before them. On the other hand, when we put like things together as a logical group, we've put convenient handles on them. Now all those things are glanceable. You can take them in all at once. Let's think of some examples. Let's consider web pages. Often we see various tiers of navigation. One group of links relates to global navigation, links like home or about us or contact us, and another set of links might be grouped according to related products, categories, something like that. If you think about Amazon.com, where they group movies, music, and games as each individual links, it's opposed to another labeled apparel, shoes, or jewelry. And it's this grouping that enables us to cope with all of the information, all of the things that they sell there. It gives it a logical order and hierarchy. We can put convenient cognitive handles on a bunch of stuff at once. There are many more examples that I'm sure you can come up with on your own because proximity is so intuitive. The trick is to think logically as you order groups of elements in your compositions. You're really using it as a strategy to streamline your audience comprehension of what you've set before them. Proximity occurs when elements are placed close together. They tend to be perceived as a group. The 9 squares, shown right here, are placed without proximity. They were just thrown in the layout, and they're perceived as separate individual shapes. When we take the same squares and they are given close proximity, unity occurs. They continue to be separate shapes, but they are now perceived as one group. If we look at another example, these 15 figures right here form a unified whole. They form the shape of a tree because of their proximity. Proximity helps create organization. By grouping similar elements together or in close proximity, you create a relationship between those elements. In design and layout, it provides a focal point and can give the reader an idea of where they should start and finish reading. Proximity doesn't mean that elements have to be placed together. It means they should be visually connected in some way. This can be the use of a point size, font, color, a rule, anything along those lines. To achieve proximity, you want to group related items together so that the related items are seen as one cohesive group rather than a bunch of unrelated items. Items or elements that are not related to each other should not be in close proximity to each other. So how do you know if a group of elements are related to each other? Well, by grouping non-related elements, you either confuse or intrigue the reader. By grouping several elements in close proximity to each other, they become one visual unit. If there are more than 3 to 5 items on the page, see which of the separate elements can be grouped together into close proximity to become one visual unit. Try to avoid too many separate elements on a page, and don't stick elements in the corners and in the middle. Try to group elements together. You can tell whether a page has too many separate elements by being conscious of where your eye is going as it reads down the page. Does your eye have to jump around the page to read it? Once you have grouped elements into visual units, make sure you have a sufficient white space between those groups. White space helps separate and announce each of these visual units. Violating the principle of proximity can be a design tool too. Let's look at some examples. The first example is the Metzger menu, and it uses proximity to help group together the various dishes on the menu. Menus are great examples of the use of proximity. Just think about how most menus group the starters together, the salads, the main courses, the desserts, etc. Without proximity, it would be very difficult to discern the different items on the menu from one another. The next example is this Kobe Group business card, and this uses proximity to group together the various parts on the card. The logo stands apart from the rest of the information and grabs the viewer's attention first and foremost. The president's name and title is separate from the address, as is the phone and the email. All in all, the card is more interesting and more organized, having a bit of space between the various elements. This Healing Arts Festival poster uses proximity, along with color, to help visually separate information about the specific event. The title and the bird visual are most predominant, and the eye is led down through the poster, getting more and more information about the who, the where, the when, and the what questions. The designer grouped related text items together, allowing the viewer to quickly absorb important information about this specific event. The final example is this World Wildlife Fund poster, and it's about life on the reef, and it actually breaks the rule of proximity and gives all the elements about the same spacing from each other. The poster is trying to visually show how much life exists in just a little chunk of reef. You can see how color and size help to group the various sea creatures. This is successful in that it does succeed in illustrating the large amount of creatures who make up the reef as their home. Breaking proximity was a good choice here, as the poster has more power and more punch using an ununiformed proximity. So hopefully this gave you a little bit more of an idea of how you can use proximity successfully in your layouts, and you definitely want to be aware of proximity because it certainly can help to lead the viewer through your piece and to provide a more cohesive overall project or layout.